This is a message of the students in the American Embassy of Tehran. We are not against the people of the USA. We are against of the United States policy in Iran.
On November 4, 1979, Iranian students stormed the United States Embassy in Tehran and seized 66 Americans as hostages. The crisis would last 444 days, dominate global headlines, and help destroy Jimmy Carter's presidency. But 2 weeks into the standoff, something unexpected happened. Ayatollah Khomeini ordered the release of 13 hostages, all of them women or African Americans, claiming they were unlikely to be spies. Among the 13 released were 8 black Americans who walked out of captivity on November 19th and 20th, while 52 of their colleagues remained trapped inside the embassy compound for over a year. Their release became one of the earliest developments in the crisis, yet it remains one of the least discussed aspects of the entire ordeal. Understanding why these particular hostages were freed requires understanding what was happening inside Iran during those chaotic early weeks following the revolution. The morning of November 4th started as an ordinary workday for the Americans stationed at the embassy. Some were Marine guards assigned to security. Others were diplomatic staff handling communications and administrative duties. None of them expected that within hours they would become prisoners at the center of an international crisis that would define US-Iran relations for decades. Groups of Iranian students began gathering near the embassy compound that morning. Demonstrations had become common in Tehran during this period, so at first the activity did not appear unusual. But the situation changed rapidly. Protesters began climbing the walls surrounding the embassy and forcing their way through the gates. Inside the compound, alarm spread as embassy personnel rushed to destroy sensitive documents and secure equipment, while protesters moved through the buildings. Within hours, the students had taken control of the entire embassy grounds. They searched offices, entered rooms, and detained the Americans inside. The takeover happened with stunning speed. One moment the embassy staff had been performing routine work. The next they were prisoners inside a seized diplomatic facility while crowds gathered outside the compound walls. For the African American diplomats and Marine guards among the hostages, the experience was just as unpredictable as it was for everyone else trapped inside. They were separated, placed under guard, and held in various locations throughout the compound while the crisis began dominating global news. Then, 2 weeks into the standoff, Khomeini made a decision that would fundamentally shape how the early crisis unfolded. On November 17th, he ordered the release of all female and African American hostages. His stated reasoning was that these individuals were unlikely to be spies and were already subject to oppression in American society.
We hear, Imam, that today, perhaps today, some black hostages and some female hostages will be released from the American embassy compound. Is that true?
The freedom of the women and blacks will be given. Women are given great dignity in Islam, and the blacks have been oppressed in the United States. Great injustice was done unto them. They were under pressure in the United States. Thus they came here. We are doing this owing to the tenets of Islam.
But the actual calculation was far more complex and strategic. Khomeini was attempting to position revolutionary Iran as a champion of the world's oppressed people, and releasing black American hostages served that narrative. The Islamic Republic had been making deliberate overtures to African American communities since taking power, holding black solidarity marches, and later even commemorating Malcolm X on a national postage stamp. The revolutionary rhetoric coming from Tehran emphasized anti-imperialism and solidarity with marginalized peoples, which resonated with some leftist African American activists at the time. Khomeini also saw an opportunity to create divisions in American public opinion by appealing to what he perceived as black radicalism in the United States. By releasing African American hostages while keeping others captive, he hoped to demonstrate that revolutionary Iran distinguished between oppressed minorities and their oppressors. The 8 African American men were escorted out of the locations where they had been held and transported away from the embassy compound. Within days, they had left Iran entirely and were on their way home. The transition from captivity to freedom happened remarkably quickly. Only weeks earlier, they had been performing routine assignments inside the embassy. After the takeover, they spent days in confinement while the crisis dominated headlines worldwide. Now they were free while 52 of their colleagues remained trapped. News organizations around the world reported their release as one of the first major developments in the hostage crisis. For the men involved, returning home meant stepping back into a country that had been closely following their situation. During their time inside the embassy, they had very limited access to the outside world. They had not seen the television broadcasts or newspaper headlines that had turned the embassy takeover into one of the most discussed international events of the time. Once they returned to the United States, reporters began asking them about their experiences. Their accounts offered some of the earliest descriptions of what life had been like inside the seized building during the beginning of the crisis. They described how quickly the situation had unfolded, how protesters had forced their way into the compound, and the uncertainty that followed as hostages waited to see what would happen next. But the brief period they spent inside the seized embassy remained part of the historical PC, in ways that highlight something important about how diplomatic crises actually unfold. The embassy staff who reported for duty that November morning had no idea their workplace would become the focal point of an international confrontation. Individuals working ordinary diplomatic assignments unexpectedly found themselves at the center of global political events that would be studied for decades. One detail from the crisis reveals the complicated dynamics at play. Charles Jones Jr., a 40-year-old communications specialist and teletype operator, was the only African-American hostage who was not released in November 1979. He remained captive for the entire 444 days. The historical record does not clearly explain why Jones was treated differently from the other Black Americans seized at the embassy, but his continued captivity demonstrates that Khomeini's decision to release African-American hostages was selective rather than absolute. For the 8 men who were released, life gradually returned to normal as they resumed their careers outside the spotlight of international politics. The hostage crisis itself continued to dominate headlines for many months, but the individuals who had been released early were no longer part of the ongoing developments in Tehran. Their experience lasted only a few weeks, yet those weeks placed them inside one of the most widely reported diplomatic confrontations of the Cold War era. The crisis would drag on for more than a year. President Carter froze Iranian assets worth approximately $8 billion, banned Iranian oil imports, and applied whatever diplomatic pressure was possible. None of it worked. An attempted rescue mission in April 1980 ended in disaster when helicopters malfunctioned and 8 American servicemen were killed in a crash at a desert staging area. Carter later said that if he had sent one more helicopter, the rescue might have succeeded and he might have won re-election. The remaining 52 hostages were finally released on January 20, 1981, moments after Ronald Reagan was inaugurated as president. They had been held captive for 444 days. The crisis had destroyed Carter's presidency, reshaped US-Iran relations for generations, and become one of the defining international events of the late Cold War period. More than 4 decades later, the release of the African-American hostages remains one of the most distinctive moments from the early weeks of the crisis. Their story highlights how global political confrontations intersect with individual lives in unexpected ways. The men who walked into the embassy that November morning were performing routine duties. Within hours, they had become hostages. Within weeks, they were free while their colleagues remained trapped for over a year. Their experience also reveals the calculated political decisions that shaped how the crisis unfolded. Khomeini's choice to release African-American hostages was not an act of mercy or humanitarian concern. It was a strategic move designed to position revolutionary Iran as a champion of oppressed peoples, create divisions in American public opinion, and signal that the new Islamic Republic distinguished between different categories of Americans based on race and perceived power. Whether that strategy succeeded is debatable. The release certainly generated headlines and briefly put Iran in a more sympathetic light with some audiences, but it did nothing to resolve the underlying crisis or prevent the 444-day standoff that followed. And for Charles Jones, the one African American who was not released, Khomeini's proclaimed solidarity with oppressed Black Americans meant nothing at all. The Iran hostage crisis is usually remembered through the lens of diplomacy, superpower tensions, and Cold War politics. But within that dramatic narrative are individual moments that reveal how global events intersect with ordinary lives. For the 8 African American men who were released in November 1979, The assignment in Iran had been routine until it suddenly was not. Their brief time as hostages placed them inside a crisis that would be studied for generations. Yet their story remains one of the quiet chapters that history almost forgot.